A boy told his mom that he had his twin at school, but his mother did not believe him. Next day, she got the shock of her life. Was this just a simple coincidence, or a darker family secret waiting to come out? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sarah hummed softly as she folded laundry in the living room of their modest new home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the freshly painted walls. She paused for a moment, looking around with a contented smile. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it represented a fresh start in the big town for their little family. The sound of the front door bursting open startled her from her thoughts. Eden rushed in, his backpack bouncing wildly as he ran towards her. "Mom! Mom!" he shouted, his eyes wide with excitement. "You won't believe what happened at school today." Sarah set down the shirt she was folding and turned to face her son. "What is it, sweetie?" she asked, her voice warm with affection. Eden's words tumbled out in a rush. "I met a boy named Mike, and he looks just like me. We must be twins." Sarah chuckled, shaking her head slightly. "Oh, Eden," she said gently. "I'm sure you two just look similar. It happens sometimes." But Eden wasn't deterred. He grabbed her hand, his small fingers wrapping around hers urgently. "No, Mom, you don't understand. He has my eyes, the exact same color and shape, and his nose is just like mine too." Sarah patted his hand, her smile indulgent. "Honey, lots of people have similar features. It doesn't mean you're twins." Eden's face fell slightly, but he pressed on. "But Mom, it's not just that. We're the same height and our hair is the same color. Even our voices sound alike." Sarah sighed, realizing Eden wasn't going to let this go easily. She knelt down to his level, looking into his earnest face. "Eden, sweetie, I know it's exciting to meet someone who looks like you, but I promise you're not twins. I would know if I had twins." Eden's brow furrowed. "But what if we got separated at birth, like in those movies?" Sarah laughed softly. "Life isn't like the movies, honey. Those things don't happen in real life." "But Mom?" "No buts," Sarah said firmly but kindly. "I'm sure Mike is a lovely boy, and it's wonderful that you've made a new friend. But you're not twins. You're our special boy, and there's only one of you." Eden's shoulders slumped, the excitement draining from his face. "You don't believe me," he said quietly. Sarah's heart ached at the disappointment in his voice. She reached out to smooth his hair. "It's not that I don't believe you, sweetie. I believe that you and Mike look very similar. But sometimes our imaginations can run away with us, especially when we're excited about something." Eden stepped back, his lower lip trembling slightly. "It's not my imagination," he insisted. "You'll see when you meet him." Sarah stood up, her knees creaking slightly. "I'm sure I will, honey, and I'm looking forward to meeting your new friend. Now, why don't you go wash up? Dinner will be ready soon." Eden nodded silently, his earlier enthusiasm completely gone. He trudged towards his room, his feet dragging on the carpet. Sarah watched him go, a small frown creasing her forehead. She hated to see him so disappointed, but she knew it was important to keep his flights of fancy in check. Still, a tiny part of her wondered at the intensity of his belief. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. Eden had always had a vivid imagination. This was just another example of it. As Eden disappeared into his room, Sarah turned back to the laundry, her mind already moving on to the tasks that still needed to be done before George, her husband, got home from work. She'd talk to Eden again later, she decided. Maybe they could look at some pictures of lookalikes online to show him how common it was for unrelated people to resemble each other. With a small sigh, she picked up another shirt to fold, pushing thoughts of Eden's twin to the back of her mind. There was still so much to do in their new home, and she was determined to make it as welcoming as possible for her family. After all, this move was a new chapter for all of them, and she wanted it to be perfect. Later that night, the aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the cozy dining room as Sarah set the last dish on the table. George had just arrived home from work, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. Eden bounced in his seat, eager to share his day with his father. "How was work, honey?" Sarah asked, passing George the bowl of mashed potatoes. George smiled tiredly. Oh, you know, same old paperwork, nothing exciting. He turned to Eden. How about you, champ? Anything interesting happen at school today? Eden's eyes lit up. Dad, you won't believe it, I met my twin. George paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. Your twin? Sarah chuckled, shaking her head. Oh, Eden's been going on about this all afternoon. He met a boy at school who looks like him. Eden nodded vigorously. His name is Mike, Dad, and he looks exactly like me. We have the same eyes, the same nose, even our voices sound alike. George's brow furrowed. Is that so? He said, his voice oddly strained. Sarah noticed the change in George's tone and gave him a curious look. She had expected him to laugh it off, maybe make a joke about Eden's imagination running wild. But instead, George seemed nervous. Yeah, it's true, Eden continued, oblivious to the tension. Mom doesn't believe me, but when you see him, you'll know. George set down his fork, his face pale. Now, Eden, he said, his voice shaky. There's no way you could have a twin. Your mother and I would know if that were the case. Sarah watched George closely, a strange feeling settling in her stomach. Why was he acting so strange about this? But Dad? Eden started to protest. No buts. George cut him off, his voice louder now. It's just not possible. You probably just met a boy who looks similar to you. It happens sometimes. Eden's shoulders slumped, disappointment clear on his face. You don't believe me either, he mumbled. Sarah reached out to pat Eden's hand. We believe that you met someone who looks like you, sweetie. It's just that the idea of secret twins is more something from movies than real life. George nodded quickly, seeming eager to end the conversation. That's right. Now why don't you tell us about what you learned in class today? Anything new in math? As Eden reluctantly began talking about his math lesson, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She kept glancing at George, noting how he avoided her gaze, focusing intently on his plate. His hands shook slightly as he cut his chicken. What was he hiding? Sarah wondered. She'd known George for years, and she could tell when something was bothering him. This wasn't just him being tired from work or stressed about a project. No, this was different. He was hiding something, and it had to do with Eden's twin. But why? What could possibly make George so nervous about a child who looked like Eden? Sarah's mind raced with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. She pushed them aside, telling herself she was being silly. There had to be a logical explanation for George's behavior. As dinner wound down, Sarah found herself lost in thought, barely tasting the food on her plate. She mechanically cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher, all while keeping an eye on George. He seemed to relax as the evening went on, but there was still a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. When it was time for bed, Sarah kissed Eden goodnight, promising him they'd talk more about his new friend tomorrow. As she crawled into bed beside George, she considered bringing up his strange reaction at dinner, but something held her back. Maybe it was the fear of what his answer might be, or maybe it was the hope that if she gave him time, he'd tell her on his own. So instead, she turned off the light and whispered, "Good night, honey," into the darkness. George's reply was soft and distracted, and Sarah lay awake long after his breathing had evened out into sleep, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. The next day at school, Eden could hardly contain his excitement. He bounced on his toes as he waited for recess, eager to find Mike and talk more about their uncanny resemblance. When the bell finally rang, he dashed out to the playground, his eyes scanning the crowd of kids for his look-alike. "Eden, over here!" Mike's voice called out from near the swing set. Eden grinned and ran over, plopping down on the swing next to Mike. "Hey, I told my parents about you last night," he said breathlessly. Mike's eyes widened. "Really? What did they say?" Eden's smile faltered a bit. They didn't believe me. My mom thought I was just making it up, and my dad got all weird about it." Mike nodded, his face falling. "Yeah, same here. My mom just laughed and said I must have made a new friend who looks a little like me." The two boys sat quietly for a moment, swinging gently back and forth. Then Eden perked up. "Wait, I have an idea." "What is it?" Mike asked, leaning in closer. "Remember how Ms. Johnson said we're having class photos tomorrow?" Eden's eyes sparkled with excitement. Mike nodded slowly, not quite following. "Yeah, so?" "So," Eden explained, "what if we stand next to each other in the photo? Then when our parents see it, they won't be able to deny how much we look alike." Mike's face lit up. "That's brilliant. There's no way they can say we're making it up if they see us side by side in a picture." The boys spent the rest of recess planning how they would make sure to be next to each other for the photo. They decided to ask Ms. Johnson if they could stand together, figuring she wouldn't mind as long as they were polite about it. As the bell rang to signal the end of recess, Eden and Mike shared a determined look. "Promise you won't forget?" Eden asked. Mike nodded solemnly. "I promise. Tomorrow we'll get proof that we're twins." Eden grinned and held out his hand. "Pinky swear?" Mike laughed and linked his pinky with Eden's. "Pinky swear." As they walked back to class, both boys felt a surge of hope. Soon, they thought, their parents would have to believe them. Soon, they'd have answers about why they looked so much alike. The rest of the school day seemed to drag on forever, but finally the last bell rang. Eden gathered his things and headed out, a spring in his step and a smile on his face. He couldn't wait for tomorrow's class photo. It would change everything, he was sure of it. The next morning, Eden woke up with a burst of energy. He jumped out of bed, got dressed in record time, and raced downstairs for breakfast. His mom, Sarah, looked at him with surprise. "Well, someone's excited for school today," she said, smiling as she placed a bowl of cereal in front of him. Eden nodded eagerly. "It's class photo day," he exclaimed between bites. Sarah chuckled. "I see. Make sure you smile big for the camera, okay?" "I will, Mom," Eden promised, his mind already racing ahead to his plan with Mike. At school, the excitement was palpable. Kids chattered about what they were wearing and how they'd style their hair. But Eden only had eyes for Mike. He found his look-alike near their classroom, fidgeting with his shirt collar. "Ready?" Eden asked, grinning. Mike nodded, a mix of nerves and excitement on his face. "Let's do this." When it was time for their class to take their photo, Eden and Mike made their way to Ms. Johnson. Eden spoke up first, his voice polite but determined. "Ms. Johnson, can Mike and I stand next to each other for the photo?" Their teacher looked surprised but smiled warmly. "Of course, boys, that's fine with me." As the class lined up, Eden and Mike positioned themselves side by side. They stood up straight, their shoulders almost touching. Eden could feel his heart pounding with anticipation. The photographer, a friendly man with a bushy mustache, peered through his camera lens. He paused, looking at Eden and Mike with a curious expression. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered, shaking his head in amazement. Eden and Mike exchanged a quick glance, trying to hold back their grins. "All right, everyone," the photographer called out. "Big smiles now. 3, 2, 1. The camera flashed, capturing the moment Eden and Mike had been waiting for. As soon as the photographer gave them the all clear, the two boys high-fived each other, their eyes shining with excitement. "We did it," Mike whispered. Eden nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. "Now, we just have to wait for the pictures." The rest of the morning seemed to crawl by. Eden found it hard to focus on his lessons, his mind constantly wandering to the class photo. He kept sneaking glances at Mike, who looked just as distracted. Finally, recess arrived. As soon as they were outside, Eden and Mike huddled together near the fence. "Do you think they'll give us the pictures today?" Mike asked anxiously. Eden shrugged. "I hope so. My mom said sometimes they develop them really fast." As if on cue, Ms. Johnson appeared in the playground holding a stack of envelopes. "Class photos are ready," she called out. Eden and Mike raced over, their hearts pounding. They each took their envelope with trembling hands. "On 3, Eden suggested. Mike nodded. 1, 2, 3. They tore open their envelopes and pulled out the glossy photos. There, in the center of the second row, stood Eden and Mike side by side, The resemblance was undeniable. Same messy brown hair, same green eyes, same dimpled smile. Eden felt a lump in his throat. "Wow," he whispered. Mike nodded, his eyes wide. "They can't say we're making it up now." The boys shared another high five, this one filled with a sense of triumph. They had done it. They had taken control of their situation, just like they planned. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Eden carefully tucked the photo into his backpack. He said goodbye to Mike, both of them buzzing with excitement about showing their parents the evidence. Eden walked home, his steps light and quick. He couldn't wait to see his mom's face when he showed her the picture. Maybe now she would believe him. Maybe now they could start getting some answers. Upon reaching home, Eden burst through the front door, his backpack bouncing against his back as he raced into the living room. "Mom! Mom!" he called out, excitement bubbling in his voice. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What's got you so worked up, sweetie?" she asked, a gentle smile on her face. Eden fumbled with his backpack, his fingers trembling as he unzipped it. "I've got something to show you," he said, pulling out the class photo. He thrust it towards his mother, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Look!" Sarah took the photo, her brow furrowing as she studied it. Eden pointed to the center of the second row, where he and Mike stood side by side. "See? That's me and Mike. We look just like each other." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the image. The resemblance was striking. The same tousled brown hair, the same bright green eyes, even the same dimpled smile. It was as if someone had taken two copies of Eden and placed them next to each other in the photo. "Oh my," Sarah breathed, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. She looked from the photo to Eden and back again, her mind racing. Eden bounced on his toes, unable to contain his excitement. "I told you, Mom! We could be brothers, maybe even twins!" Sarah sank onto the couch, still staring at the photo. The resemblance was undeniable, and for the first time she began to wonder if there might be some truth to Eden's claims. Could it be possible? But how? "Eden, honey," she said slowly, "this is quite something. I have to admit, you two do look very much alike." Eden's face lit up. "So you believe me now?" Sarah hesitated, not wanting to jump to conclusions, but also not wanting to dismiss her son's feelings. "I believe that there's definitely a strong resemblance," she said carefully, "but I don't know what it means yet. We need more information." Eden nodded eagerly. "Can we talk to Mike's mom? Maybe she knows something?" Sarah considered this for a moment. It was a reasonable suggestion, and she had to admit she was curious herself. "You know what? That's not a bad idea. I think I'll give her a call." She stood up and went to the kitchen, picking up the phone. She dialed the school's number, her heart beating a little faster as she waited for someone to answer. "Hello, Maple Grove Elementary," came the receptionist's cheery voice. "Hi, this is Sarah Elliott, Eden's mother," Sarah said. "I was wondering if I could speak to Eden's teacher, Ms. Johnson." After a brief hold, Ms. Johnson came on the line. Sarah explained the situation, trying to keep her voice calm despite her growing curiosity. "Oh yes," Ms. Johnson said. "I noticed the resemblance between Eden and Mike myself. It's quite remarkable. Would it be possible for you to give me Mike's mother's contact information?" Sarah asked. "I'd like to reach out to her about this." Ms. Johnson agreed, and soon Sarah was jotting down Clara Parker's phone number on a notepad. She thanked the teacher and hung up, staring at the number for a long moment. Eden appeared at her side, his eyes hopeful. "Did you get it? Are you going to call her?" Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. "Yes, I got the number. I'll give Mike's mom a call and see if we can figure this out together." Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the phone's keypad. She glanced at Eden, who was watching her with wide, expectant eyes. "Here goes," she murmured, dialing Clara's number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Sarah's heart raced with each ring. Just as she thought it might go to voicemail, a woman's voice answered. "Hello?" "Hi, is this Clara Parker?" Sarah asked, her voice slightly shaky. Yes, it is. Who's calling? Sarah swallowed hard. My name is Sarah Elliott. I'm Eden's mom. Eden is in the same class as your son, Mike. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Oh yes, Eden. Mike's been talking about him a lot lately. Sarah nodded, even though Clara couldn't see her. That's actually why I'm calling. Eden showed me the class photo today, and, well, I couldn't help but notice how much our boys look alike. Clara's voice softened. I know. Mike showed me the picture too. It's uncanny, isn't it? It really is, Sarah agreed. She took another deep breath. I was wondering if maybe we could meet up somewhere to talk about this. I know it might seem strange, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something more to this than just a coincidence. Clara was quiet for a moment, and Sarah worried she might have overstepped. But then Clara spoke, her voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of nervousness. You know what? I think that's a good idea. I've been wondering about it myself. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thank you, Clara. I appreciate your willingness to meet. Is there a coffee shop or somewhere you'd feel comfortable getting together? There's a little place called the Cozy Cup on Main Street, Clara suggested. It's quiet and they have great coffee. How about tomorrow afternoon, say around 3? That sounds perfect, Sarah said, jotting down the details on her notepad. I'll see you there. As she hung up the phone, Sarah noticed Eden bouncing on his toes. Well? He asked eagerly. Sarah smiled at her son. I'm going to meet Mike's mom tomorrow. We're going to talk about you two and try to figure out what's going on. Eden's face lit up. Really? Can I come too? Sarah shook her head gently. Not this time, sweetie. We grown-ups need to talk first. But I promise I'll tell you everything after, okay? Eden nodded, looking a little disappointed but still excited. Okay, Mom. As Eden scampered off to his room, Sarah's mind turned to George. She remembered his nervous reaction when Eden first mentioned Mike at dinner. The way he'd quickly changed the subject, his unease. It made her wonder if he knew something he wasn't telling her. For a moment, she considered calling George at work to tell him about the meeting with Clara, but something held her back. If he did know something, he'd had plenty of opportunities to tell her. Why hadn't he? No, Sarah decided. She wouldn't tell George about the meeting, at least not yet. She needed to talk to Clara first, to see if there was really anything to this strange situation. Only then would she confront George with whatever she discovered. As she started preparing dinner, Sarah's mind whirled with questions. What would she learn from Clara tomorrow? Could Eden and Mike really be related somehow? And if they were, how was that possible? She glanced at the clock. Less than 24 hours until her meeting with Clara. Sarah had a feeling that tomorrow might change everything. Next day, Sarah arrived at the Cozy Cup 15 minutes early, her nerves on edge. She chose a quiet corner table and ordered a latte, fidgeting with the photo of Eden she'd brought along. As she waited, her eyes darted to the door each time it opened. Finally, a woman with kind eyes and curly brown hair walked in, looking around uncertainly. Sarah stood up and waved, catching her attention. Clara? She asked as the woman approached. Clara nodded, a nervous smile on her face. Sarah? It's nice to meet you. They shook hands and Clara sat down across from Sarah. A waiter came by and Clara ordered a cappuccino. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Sarah said, her voice soft. I know this is unusual. Clara nodded. It is, but I'm glad you called. Mike hasn't stopped talking about Eden since they met. Sarah took a deep breath and placed Eden's photo on the table. This is my son, Eden. Clara's eyes widened as she looked at the picture. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached into her purse and pulled out a photo of her own. She placed it next to Eden's. Sarah gasped. The resemblance was uncanny. The boys could have been mirror images of each other. Oh my goodness, Sarah whispered, her hand covering her mouth. Clara nodded, her face pale. I didn't want to believe it at first. When Mike came home talking about his twin at school, I thought he was just being imaginative. But now, Sarah looked up at Clara, her eyes filled with confusion and a hint of fear. How is this possible? I don't understand. Clara took a sip of her cappuccino, her hands shaking slightly. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Mike, he's adopted. Sarah's eyes widened. Adopted? Clara nodded. I adopted him when he was just a baby. I don't know much about his birth parents or where he came from. The adoption agency didn't have a lot of information. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. She looked at the photos again, then back at Clara. I need to tell you something too. When Eden was born, it was a difficult delivery. I fainted during labor and I don't remember much of what happened. Clara leaned forward, listening intently. Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. When I woke up, George, my husband, was holding the baby. He told me everything was fine, that we had a beautiful son. I never questioned it. And now? Clara asked gently. Sarah shook her head. Now I don't know what to think. When Eden first mentioned Mike, George acted strange. He got nervous and changed the subject quickly. I've never seen him like that before. Clara reached out and placed her hand on Sarah's. This must be so confusing for you. Sarah nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes. I need to know the truth, for Eden's sake, and for Mike's too. Clara squeezed Sarah's hand. We'll figure this out together. I want answers just as much as you do. The two women sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Finally, Sarah spoke up. What should we do now? Clara took a deep breath. I think we need to keep investigating. Maybe we can look into records from around the time the boys were born. And, Sarah, I think you need to talk to George. He might know more than he's letting on. Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. You're right. I'll talk to him tonight. As they gathered their things to leave, Clara turned to Sarah. We're in this together now. Whatever we find out, we'll face it as a team. Sarah smiled gratefully. Thank you, Clara. I'm so glad we met. The two mothers hugged goodbye, each carrying a mix of hope and apprehension as they left the coffee shop. They knew that whatever lay ahead, it would change their lives forever. Sarah drove home from the coffee shop, her mind swirling with questions. The steering wheel felt slippery under her sweaty palms as she navigated the familiar streets. Every few seconds, her eyes darted to the photo of Eden on the passenger seat right next to the one of Mike. How could I not know? She whispered to herself, shaking her head. As she pulled into the driveway, Sarah took a deep breath. She needed to talk to George, but she wasn't sure how to bring it up. The memory of his nervous reaction at dinner the other night made her stomach churn. Inside, Sarah found George in the living room reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled as she entered. Hey, honey, how was your day? He asked. Sarah hesitated, then sat down on the couch next to him. George, can we talk about something? He folded the newspaper and set it aside. Sure. What's on your mind? Sarah took a deep breath. It's about Eden's birth. I've been thinking a lot about it lately, and I realize there's so much I don't remember. George's smile faltered for a moment. What do you mean? Well, I fainted during the delivery, remember? And when I woke up, you were holding Eden. But I don't recall anything in between, Sarah explained, watching George's face carefully. George shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing. Sarah, that was 10 years ago. Why are you bringing this up now? Sarah leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. I feel like there might be things I don't know. Things that happened while I was unconscious. Can you tell me more about what happened? George stood up abruptly, his face tightening. There's nothing to tell, Sarah. You had a difficult labor, but everything turned out fine. We have a healthy, happy son. Why are you overthinking this? Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. George's reaction was exactly what she'd feared. I'm not overthinking, George. I'm just trying to understand. There's nothing to understand. George cut her off, his voice sharp. You're making something out of nothing. Can we please drop this? Sarah stood up too, frustration building inside her. But George, Eden met a boy at school who looks exactly like him. Don't you think that's strange? George's face paled slightly, but he quickly composed himself. It's just a coincidence, Sarah. Kids that age often look similar. You're letting your imagination run wild. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, her mind still racing with questions. She tiptoed downstairs, careful not to wake George. In the kitchen, she dialed Clara's number, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara, it's Sarah. I was thinking you should visit the adoption center today. Maybe they can give us some answers. George, who had just reached the bottom of the stairs, froze. His wife's hushed voice drifted from the kitchen, and he strained to hear more. Yes, I think that's a good idea, Sarah continued. I will go there early morning. I'll tell George I'm going shopping. George's jaw clenched. He retreated silently up the stairs, his mind whirling. In their bedroom, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number. John? It's George. I need a favor, he said quietly. Can you cover for me at the office today? Something's come up. After hanging up, George dressed quickly. He headed downstairs, plastering on a smile as he entered the kitchen. Morning, honey, he said, kissing Sarah's cheek. I've got an early meeting today. Might be home late. Sarah nodded, avoiding his eyes. Okay, I might go shopping later. George grabbed his briefcase and headed out, his heart pounding. In his car, he opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. He thumbed through the cash inside, then tucked it into his jacket pocket. The drive to the adoption center felt endless. George's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his mind racing with what he needed to do. At the center, George strode purposefully to the reception desk. I need to speak with the director, he said, his voice low and urgent. It's a sensitive matter. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded and picked up the phone. A few minutes later, George was ushered into a small office. The director, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up as he entered. How can I help you, sir? George sat down, leaning forward. I need your discretion on a delicate matter, he began, pulling out the envelope. My wife might come here asking questions about our son's adoption. I can't let her find out the truth. He slid a photo of Sarah across the desk. This is her. If she comes in, I need you to tell her there are no records, no information at all. The director frowned, looking at the envelope. Sir, we can't just… George cut her off, pushing the envelope towards her. Please, you don't understand what's at stake here. My family will fall apart if she learns the truth. The director's eyes widened at the amount of cash. She hesitated, then slowly took the envelope. I understand, she said quietly. We'll keep your wife's visit confidential if she comes. George nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you, he said, standing up. You have no idea how important this is. He then went back outside to sit in his car. George felt a mix of guilt and determination. He hated lying to Sarah, but he told himself it was for her own good. He couldn't let her discover the truth about Eden's birth. Not now, not ever. On the other hand, Sarah also left home early, thinking of reaching the adoption center in time. Sarah's heart raced as she pulled into the adoption center's parking lot. She had just dropped Eden off at school, her mind swirling with questions and hopes for answers. As she approached the entrance, a familiar car caught her eye. It was George's, pulling out of the lot. What in the world? She muttered, frowning. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and dialed George's number. He picked up on the third ring. Hey honey, what's up? His voice sounded strained. George, where are you? Sarah asked, watching his car slow at a stop sign. I'm at the office, of course, just got in, why? Sarah's stomach dropped. She could see him clearly through his car window, phone pressed to his ear as he drove away. No reason, she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll talk to you later. She hung up, her hand shaking slightly. Why would George lie? And what was he doing at the adoption center? Taking a deep breath, Sarah squared her shoulders and walked into the building. The reception area was quiet, with just a few people waiting in chairs. She approached the front desk, where a young woman greeted her with a smile. "Good morning, how can I help you?" Sarah cleared her throat. "Hi, I'm here to inquire about some adoption records for a boy named Mike. He would have been adopted about 10 years ago." The receptionist's smile faltered for a moment. "Let me check with my supervisor," she said, picking up the phone. Sarah waited, her fingers drumming nervously on the counter. After a brief conversation, the receptionist hung up and turned back to her. "I'm sorry, but we can't share any information about adoptions without proper authorization." "But I'm not asking for details," Sarah protested. "I just need to know if there's a record of his adoption." The young woman shifted uncomfortably. "I understand, but we really can't disclose anything. It's our policy." Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. "Please, this is really important. I think Mike might be my son's twin brother. I just need to know if there's any possibility." "I'm sorry," the receptionist interrupted, her voice firm but sympathetic. "We truly can't help you. You'd need to go through proper legal channels for this kind of information." Sarah stepped back, frustration building inside her. She glanced around the room, noticing how some of the staff were avoiding eye contact with her. "Is there someone else I could speak to? A manager, perhaps?" The receptionist shook her head. "I'm afraid not. We've been instructed not to discuss this further." Sarah's eyes narrowed. Instructed by whom? The young woman looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I can't say anything more, I'm sorry." Realizing she wasn't going to get anywhere, Sarah turned and walked out of the center. As she reached her car, she paused, leaning against the door. Her mind was racing. George's presence here, his lie about being at work, and now the staff's strange behavior. It all pointed to something bigger going on. She took a deep breath, feeling a new determination settle over her. If the adoption center wouldn't give her answers, she'd find them another way. Whatever was going on, she was going to get to the bottom of it. She then decided to call Clara and tell her what she just witnessed. The events at the adoption center had left her shaken, and she desperately needed to talk to someone who would understand. "Clara?" "It's Sarah," she said when the other woman answered. "Something strange happened at the adoption center today." "What is it?" Clara asked, concern evident in her voice. Sarah took a deep breath and recounted her experience. George's car in the parking lot, his lie about being at work, and the staff's refusal to help her. "It's like they were hiding something," Sarah finished. "I don't know what to think anymore." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That does sound suspicious," she agreed. "But we can't give up now. We need to find out the truth for our boys." "But how?" Sarah asked, feeling defeated. "The adoption center won't help us, and George—" She trailed off, not wanting to voice her growing suspicions about her husband. "What about a DNA test?" Clara suddenly suggested. "If Eden and Mike really are twins, that would prove it beyond any doubt." Sarah's heart leapt. "That's brilliant, why didn't I think of that?" They quickly made a plan. Clara knew of a clinic that could do rapid DNA testing, with results available in just a couple of days. "We should take the boys there tomorrow morning," Clara said. "The sooner we know, the better." Sarah hesitated. "What about George? Should I tell him?" Clara paused before answering. "Given how he's been acting, it might be best to keep this between us for now, just until we know for sure." Sarah nodded, even though Clara couldn't see her. It felt wrong to keep secrets from George, but his recent behavior had left her feeling uncertain and confused. "Okay," she agreed. "Let's meet at the clinic tomorrow at 9 a.m. I'll tell Eden we're going for a checkup." As she hung up the phone, Sarah felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. Tomorrow could change everything, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what they might discover. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Sarah's heart. She dressed Eden quickly, telling him they were going for a special checkup. His eyes lit up with curiosity. "Is Mike going to be there?" Eden asked eagerly. Sarah nodded, smiling despite her nerves. "Yes, sweetie. Mike and his mom will meet us there." As they drove to the clinic, Sarah's mind raced. She kept glancing at Eden in the rearview mirror, wondering if her whole world was about to change. They arrived at the clinic to find Clara and Mike already waiting. The two boys rushed to each other, grinning from ear to ear. "Remember," Clara said softly to Mike, "this is our secret for now, okay?" Mike nodded solemnly, but his excitement was palpable. Inside the clinic, a kind nurse explained the procedure to the boys. "We're just going to swab the inside of your cheeks," she said, demonstrating with a long cotton swab. "It won't hurt at all." Eden and Mike sat side by side, holding hands as the nurse took their samples. Sarah and Clara exchanged glances, both struck by how natural the boys looked together. "All done," the nurse announced cheerfully. "You two were very brave." As they waited for the paperwork to be processed, Sarah and Clara watched their sons play in the small waiting area. The boys seemed to move in perfect sync, finishing each other's sentences and laughing at jokes only they understood. "They really do act like twins," Clara murmured, her eyes misty. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I've never seen Eden bond with anyone so quickly." The nurse returned with some forms for Sarah and Clara to sign. "The results will be ready in a couple of days," she explained. "We'll call you as soon as they're in." As they prepared to leave, Sarah knelt down to Eden's level. "Remember, sweetie, this is our special secret for now. We don't want to worry Dad until we know for sure, okay?" Eden nodded, his face serious. "I promise, Mom." The two families said their goodbyes in the parking lot, the boys hugging tightly as if they might never see each other again. As Sarah buckled Eden into his car seat, she couldn't help but feel that their lives were on the brink of a massive change. Whatever the results might be, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Once they got home, she helped Eden out of the car. She plastered on a smile, determined to keep her worries hidden from her son. Inside, George was already home, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up as they entered, his eyes searching Sarah's face. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze intense. Sarah swallowed hard, remembering his car at the adoption center. "Fine," she replied curtly. "Eden, why don't you go wash up for dinner?" As Eden scampered off, Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, avoiding George's eyes. She could feel his stare boring into her back as she chopped vegetables with more force than necessary. "Sarah," George said softly, coming up behind her, "is everything okay?" She tensed, her knife pausing mid-chop. "Everything's fine," she lied, her voice flat. George reached out to touch her shoulder, but she shrugged him off, moving to the stove. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Throughout dinner, Sarah remained distant, responding to George's attempts at conversation with short, clipped answers. Eden, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, chattered happily about his day at school, carefully avoiding any mention of Mike or their secret trip to the clinic. As Sarah cleared the table, George tried once more to break through her icy demeanor. "Honey, you seem upset. Did something happen today?" Sarah paused, dishes in hand, and for a moment she was tempted to confront him about his lie. But the fear of what that confrontation might reveal held her back. "I'm just tired," she said finally, forcing a small smile. "It's been a long day." George's brow furrowed, concern and suspicion warring in his eyes. "Are you sure that's all it is?" "Yes, George," Sarah snapped, her patience wearing thin. "I said I'm fine. Can't you just leave it alone?" Hurt flashed across George's face, quickly replaced by a guarded expression. He nodded slowly, pushing back from the table. "All right, I'll be in the study if you need me." As George left the room, Sarah felt a pang of guilt. She hated lying to him, hated the distance that had grown between them. But until she knew the truth about Eden's origins, she couldn't bring herself to confront him. Later that night, as Sarah tucked Eden into bed, he looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mom," he whispered, "why doesn't my twin stay with us?" Sarah's heart clenched. She sat on the edge of his bed, stroking his hair gently. "Oh, sweetie," she said softly, "we don't know for sure if Mike is your twin. That's why we did that special test today, remember?" Eden nodded solemnly. "But if he is my twin, can he come live with us?" Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. I don't know, honey, she admitted. But no matter what happens, you know Daddy and I love you very much, right? Eden nodded again, yawning widely. I love you too, Mom, he murmured, his eyes drifting closed. Sarah sat there for a long time, watching her son sleep, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Eventually, she kissed Eden's forehead and quietly left the room. In the hallway, she paused outside the closed door of George's study. She could hear him moving around inside, probably working late as he often did. For a moment, she considered going in, confronting him with her suspicions. But the fear of what she might learn held her back. Instead, she retreated to their bedroom, crawling into bed alone. As she lay there in the darkness, Sarah wondered how long they could go on like this, with secrets and suspicions building walls between them. The next few days passed in a blur for Sarah. Her mind was constantly preoccupied with thoughts of the DNA test results, making it difficult to concentrate on anything else. At home, she went through the motions of daily life, cooking meals and helping Eden with his homework, but her heart wasn't in it. Finally, on the second day after the test, Sarah's phone rang. Her heart leaped when she saw Clara's name on the screen. Sarah? Clara's voice was tense with excitement. The clinic just called. They have the results. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They do? What did they say? Nothing yet, Clara replied. They said we need to come in person to get the envelope. I picked it up, but I haven't opened it. I thought, maybe we could do it together? Sarah nodded, then remembered Clara couldn't see her. Yes, absolutely. Where should we meet? Why don't you come to my place? Clara suggested. The boys are at school and we'll have some privacy. Okay, Sarah agreed, her voice shaky. I'll be there in 20 minutes. As she hung up, Sarah's hands trembled. This was it. The moment of truth was finally here. Sarah arrived at Clara's house, her heart pounding. Clara greeted her at the door with a nervous smile, and they made their way to the living room. The envelope sat on the coffee table, innocuous yet life-changing. Are you ready? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. With trembling hands, Clara picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. She pulled out the paper inside and unfolded it. Both women leaned in, their eyes scanning the document. There, in black and white, was the truth they had been seeking. The results showed a 99.9% probability that Eden and Mike were identical twins. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Clara let out a choked sob, tears welling up in her eyes. They're really twins, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. I can't believe it. All this time, Mike had a brother out there. The reality of the situation crashed over Sarah like a wave. Her son, her precious Eden, had a twin brother she never knew about. How was this possible? What had happened during that hazy time after his birth? I don't understand, Sarah said, her voice shaking. How could this have happened? Why didn't I know? As the initial shock began to wear off, a mix of emotions flooded through Sarah. Joy at discovering Eden had a brother, confusion about how this could have happened, and a growing anger towards George. He must have known something. His strange behavior, his lies, it all made sense now. I'm so relieved, Clara said softly, breaking into Sarah's thoughts. I've always wondered about Mike's background, where he came from. Now I know a piece of his history. Sarah nodded, understanding Clara's relief. But for her, the revelation brought more questions than answers. She felt a surge of anger building inside her. I need to talk to George, Sarah said, her voice tight with emotion. He has to know something about this. He's been acting so strange ever since Eden mentioned Mike. Clara squeezed her hand again. You're right. You need answers. But Sarah, be careful. This is a delicate situation. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. I know. I can't believe he would keep something like this from me. From Eden. As she sat there, holding the proof of her son's twin in her hands, Sarah felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. There was joy at discovering this new connection for Eden, but it was overshadowed by a sense of betrayal and confusion. "What do we tell the boys?" Clara asked softly. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. I think I need to talk to George first. I need to understand what happened before we say anything to Eden and Mike." Clara nodded in agreement. "That makes sense. Take your time, Sarah. This is a lot to process." As Sarah prepared to leave, she felt a storm of emotions brewing inside her. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, driving home from Clara's house. The DNA results felt like they were burning a hole in her purse. Her mind raced with questions, anger, and confusion. How could George have kept this secret for so long? As she pulled into their driveway, Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation ahead. It was Sunday, and she knew George would be home. She walked through the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She found George in the living room, lounging on the couch with a book. He looked up as she entered, a smile on his face that quickly faded when he saw her expression. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, sitting up straight. Sarah pulled the DNA results from her purse and held them up. "I think you know what's wrong, George. I want the truth about Eden. Now." George's face paled and he swallowed hard. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me anymore." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "I have proof that Eden has an identical twin, a boy named Mike who was adopted. So I'll ask you one more time. What's the truth about Eden's adoption?" George's shoulders slumped and he closed his eyes, looking defeated. When he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered. "I never meant for you to find out like this." Sarah sank into a nearby chair, her legs feeling weak. "So it's true? Eden is adopted?" George nodded slowly. "Yes, it's true. But please let me explain." "I'm listening," Sarah said, her voice cold. George took a deep breath. "Do you remember how difficult your pregnancy was? The complications during delivery?" Sarah nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. "Well, there's something I never told you," George continued, his voice shaking. "Our biological child, he was stillborn." Sarah gasped, feeling like all the air had been sucked out of the room. "What? No, that can't be true. I held Eden after he was born. I remember—" George shook his head. "You were unconscious for a while after the delivery. When you woke up, you were so weak, so fragile. I couldn't bear to tell you the truth. I was afraid it would break you." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she listened, her world crumbling around her. "So I made a decision," George went on. "I found out about a set of twin boys who had just been born and put up for adoption. I arranged to adopt one of them. That's Eden." "How could you do this?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with pain and betrayal. "How could you keep this from me for so many years?" George moved to kneel in front of her, reaching for her hands, but she pulled away. "I thought I was protecting you, Sarah. I couldn't stand the thought of you going through that pain. I thought if we had a baby to love, it would help us heal." Sarah stood up abruptly, needing to put distance between them. "You had no right to make that decision for me, George. No right to keep this secret. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I know it was wrong," George continued, his voice pleading. "But when I saw Eden for the first time, when I held him in my arms, I knew I'd do anything to protect our family, to protect you from the pain of losing our biological child." He moved closer to Sarah, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away. "I've been paying the adoption center a yearly fee to keep everything under wraps," he admitted. "That's why I was there the other day when you saw me. I was making sure they wouldn't tell you anything if you came asking questions." Sarah listened in stunned silence, her mind reeling from the revelations. The depth of George's deception was overwhelming. For 10 years, he had carried this secret, orchestrating an elaborate lie that had shaped their entire family life. She felt a complex mix of emotions washing over her: betrayal, anger, sadness, and a deep, aching loss for the child she never got to mourn. The son or daughter she and George had created together, whose existence had been erased by George's well-intentioned but misguided actions. Without looking at George, Sarah stood up. Her legs felt unsteady, and she gripped the bedpost for support. I need some time alone, she said, her voice hollow. Please, George, just give me some space. George nodded, his face a mask of regret and sorrow. Of course, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant to hurt you like this. Sarah didn't respond. She walked slowly to the bedroom door, feeling as if she were moving through a fog. As she stepped into the room, she turned back to George one last time. Don't follow me, she said quietly. I need to process this on my own. With that, she closed the door behind her, leaving George alone with the weight of his actions. Lying on her bed, she stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy with the weight of George's confession. As she tossed and turned, Sarah found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her family. The son she had loved and nurtured for 10 years wasn't biologically hers. The thought made her stomach churn. Can I still love Eden the same way? She whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. Memories of Eden's first steps, his first words, and countless bedtime stories flooded her mind. She remembered the pride she felt when he learned to ride a bike, the comfort she offered when he skinned his knee. Each moment was etched in her heart, a testament to the bond they shared. But now, knowing the truth, Sarah felt a creeping doubt. Would these memories be tainted by the knowledge that Eden wasn't truly hers? Could she look at him without seeing the lie that brought him into their lives? As the night wore on, Sarah felt suffocated by the four walls of her bedroom. She needed air, space to think. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake George, who had fallen into a fitful sleep on the couch. She padded down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cool hardwood floor. Without really thinking about it, she found herself outside Eden's room. The door was slightly ajar, and Sarah hesitated for a moment before gently pushing it open. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow on Eden's sleeping form. Sarah stepped inside, her heart clenching at the sight of her son, because despite everything, that's what he was. Eden's chest rose and fell with each peaceful breath. His dark hair, so much like Mike's, was tousled on the pillow. One arm was wrapped around his favorite stuffed bear, a gift Sarah had given him on his 5th birthday. As she watched him sleep, Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The love she felt for this child, this beautiful boy who had brought so much joy into her life, hadn't diminished. If anything, it felt stronger, more fiercely protective. She realized then that biology didn't define their relationship. The sleepless nights, the skinned knees, the shared laughter and tears, these were the threads that wove their bond. Eden was her son, not because she had given birth to him, but because she had raised him, loved him, and would do anything to protect him. Sarah moved closer to the bed, gently brushing a strand of hair from Eden's forehead. He stirred slightly but didn't wake, a small smile playing on his lips as if he was having a pleasant dream. In that moment, Sarah knew that her love for Eden hadn't changed. It didn't matter how he came into her life. What mattered was the love and care she had given him every day since. She leaned down and placed a soft kiss on his cheek, her heart full of love and gratitude for this precious child who had made her a mother. The next morning, Sarah found George in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee with tired eyes. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "George," she said softly, causing him to look up. "We need to talk." George nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I know," he replied, his voice heavy with regret. Sarah sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "What you did? It hurt me deeply," she began. "The lies, the secrets. I felt like I didn't know you anymore." George winced, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant to." "Let me finish," Sarah interrupted gently. "I'm hurt, yes, but I've had time to think, and I understand why you did it." George looked up, surprise etched on his face. "You were trying to protect me from the pain of losing our child," Sarah continued, her voice wavering slightly. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you, carrying that burden alone all these years." Tears welled up in George's eyes. I thought I was doing the right thing, he whispered. I couldn't bear to see you in pain. Sarah reached across the table, taking George's hand in hers. I know, and while I wish you had been honest with me from the start, I understand your intentions were good. She took a deep breath before continuing. I want you to know that despite everything, my love for Eden hasn't changed. If anything, it's grown stronger. He's our son, George. Biology doesn't change that. George squeezed her hand, relief washing over his face. I'm so glad to hear that, Sarah. I've been so worried about how this would affect your relationship with Eden. He's my son, Sarah said firmly. Nothing will ever change that. George nodded, wiping away a tear. I'm so sorry for everything, Sarah. I promise, from now on, no more secrets, no more lies. I'll be completely honest with you, always. Sarah gave him a small smile. I appreciate that, George. But you need to understand that rebuilding trust will take time. It won't happen overnight. I know, George replied earnestly. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I love you, Sarah, and I love our family. I want to make things right. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Finally, George spoke again, his voice filled with cautious hope. Do you think we can heal from this? Together? Sarah looked at him, seeing the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. The man who, despite his mistakes, had always tried to do what he thought was best for. Next day, she called Clara to tell her everything. Clara, it's Sarah. I need to talk to you about something important. Clara's voice came through warm and concerned. Of course, Sarah. Is everything okay? Sarah closed her eyes, steeling herself. I confronted George last night. He told me everything. There was a pause on the other end. Everything? Clara asked softly. Yes, Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly. Eden was adopted. Our biological child. He didn't make it. Clara gasped. Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. Sarah recounted George's confession, explaining how he had arranged the adoption to spare her the pain of losing their baby. As she spoke, tears rolled down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you, Clara said when Sarah finished. How are you feeling? Sarah wiped her eyes. Honestly? I'm not sure. Part of me is angry and hurt that George kept this from me for so long. But another part, I understand why he did it. That's completely understandable, Clara reassured her. It's a lot to process. The thing is, Sarah continued, despite everything, my love for Eden hasn't changed. He's still my son, no matter what. Clara's voice was warm with approval. Of course he is. Love isn't about biology, Sarah. It's about the bond you've built over the years. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Thank you, Clara. I'm so glad I can talk to you about this. I don't know what I'd do if I had to face this alone. You're not alone, Clara said firmly. I'm here for you, whatever you need. Sarah smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. That means so much to me. And speaking of not being alone, what about the boys, Eden and Mike? Clara's voice brightened. What are you thinking? Well, Sarah said, now that everything's out in the open, I think it's important for them to spend time together, to get to know each other as brothers. I couldn't agree more, Clara replied enthusiastically. They deserve the chance to build a relationship. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. What if we set up regular play dates, maybe even family gatherings where we can all spend time together? That's a wonderful idea, Clara said. I'm sure the boys would love it, and it would give us a chance to support each other through this transition too. Sarah nodded, even though Clara couldn't see her. Exactly. I think it would be good for all of us. They spent the next few minutes discussing potential dates and activities, their enthusiasm growing with each suggestion. As they wrapped up the call, Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her. "Thank you again, Clara," she said, "for everything." "Of course, Sarah, we're in this together now," Clara replied warmly. "I'll talk to Mike about the play dates and let you know what he thinks." As Sarah hung up the phone, she couldn't help but smile. Despite the challenges ahead, she felt hopeful. The boys would have a chance to bond, to know each other as brothers, and she and Clara would be there to support them every step of the way. Later that evening, the sun cast a warm glow over Clara's cozy home as Sarah and George pulled into the driveway. Eden bounced excitedly in the back seat, his face pressed against the window. "Look, there's Mike," he shouted, pointing to the boy waving enthusiastically from the front porch. Sarah took a deep breath, squeezing George's hand. "Ready?" she asked softly. George nodded, a mix of nervousness and determination in his eyes. "As I'll ever be." As they stepped out of the car, Clara appeared in the doorway, a welcoming smile on her face. "Come on in, everyone," she called out. Eden raced ahead, high-fiving Mike as he reached the porch. The two boys immediately launched into excited chatter, their words tumbling over each other. Sarah and George approached more slowly, arms laden with dishes they'd prepared for the dinner. Clara ushered them inside, the aroma of roasting chicken filling the air. "I hope you like rosemary chicken," Clara said, leading them to the kitchen. "It's Mike's favorite." "Eden loves it too," Sarah replied, setting down her casserole dish. She paused, struck by another similarity between the boys. In the living room, Eden and Mike were already deep in conversation, their heads bent close together as they compared Pokémon cards. "They certainly hit it off quickly," George observed, his voice a mix of awe and uncertainty. As they began to eat, the conversation flowed more easily. The boys regaled the adults with stories from school, finishing each other's sentences as if they'd known each other their whole lives. Sarah found herself relaxing, drawn into Clara's easy warmth. They swapped stories about the boys' early years, marveling at the similarities in their personalities and habits. George, initially quiet, gradually opened up as well. He shared a few funny anecdotes about Eden's toddler years, earning giggles from both boys. As the meal wound down, Eden turned to Mike with a mischievous grin. "Want to see my new remote control car? I brought it with me." Mike's eyes lit up. "Yeah, can we play with it in the backyard, Mom?" Clara nodded, smiling at their excitement. "Of course. Just be careful not to run it into the flower beds, okay?" The boys raced off, their laughter echoing through the house. The adults moved to the patio, watching as Eden and Mike took turns steering the car through an impromptu obstacle course of sticks and rocks. "They really are two peas in a pod, aren't they?" Clara mused, her voice soft with wonder. Sarah nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "It's amazing to see them together like this." George, standing slightly apart, cleared his throat. I'm glad they have this chance to know each other," he said quietly. Sarah reached out, taking his hand. She knew they still had a long way to go in rebuilding their trust, but this felt like a step in the right direction. As the evening progressed, the boys' laughter filled the air, punctuated by excited shouts and the whir of the remote control car. Sarah and Clara found themselves deep in conversation, sharing their hopes and fears for the future. George, initially hovering on the edges of the group, gradually relaxed. He even joined the boys for a while, helping them set up a more elaborate racetrack for the car. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the love of their newly expanded family, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road hadn't been easy, but it had led them here, to this beautiful, unexpected new chapter in their lives. If you enjoyed the story of Sarah, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.